Let's start with what should be an impossibility. Russia is the third largest oil producer on the planet. It sits on some of the largest proven petroleum reserves in the world. And yet, this week, drivers in Moscow, not some remote provincial town, but Moscow, the seat of Russian state power, are sitting in traffic queues that stretch for blocks, waiting to put limited quantities of gasoline into their tanks before a supplier runs dry or imposes a new restriction. If you'd told a military planner 3 years ago that this is where the Russian Federation would find itself in the summer of its fourth year of full-scale war in Ukraine, most of them would have called it strategic fantasy. It isn't fantasy. It's the result of a campaign that has been built, refined, and executed with real operational discipline, and it deserves to be studied as exactly that, not as a news curiosity, but as a case study in how a numerically and economically inferior power can impose disproportionate cost on a larger one by understanding the difference between tactical targets and strategic ones. I want to be precise about what's actually happening here, because the loose way this story gets reported in most outlets obscures the military logic behind it. This is not a bombing campaign aimed at terrorizing a population. It is a deliberate interdiction campaign aimed at a finite, identifiable, and irreplaceable set of nodes in Russia's downstream petroleum infrastructure, the refineries that convert crude into usable fuel, the pumping stations and pipelines that move crude to those refineries, and the storage depots that buffer the system against exactly this kind of disruption. Anyone who has studied military logistics understands that an army, and for that matter a modern industrial economy, does not run on barrels of crude sitting in the ground. It runs on refined product, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, delivered to the right place at the right time in the right quantity. Crude oil in a Siberian field does nothing for a tank crew in the Zaporizhzhia sector or a commuter trying to get to work in Tver. The choke point in any fuel-dependent economy is not extraction, it's refining and distribution. And that is precisely where Ukraine has chosen to apply pressure. The most consequential strike in this latest wave hit the Moscow refinery in the Kapotnya district, on the southeastern edge of the capital. This is not a peripheral facility. It is the single largest fuel supplier to the Moscow metropolitan region, responsible by some estimates for somewhere in the range of 40 to 50% of the fuel consumed by vehicles in and around the city. And it also produces a significant share of the aviation fuel used by Moscow's airports. When Ukrainian strike drones found their way to this facility's primary processing unit, the damage didn't just dent output at the margins. Reporting and geolocated footage indicate the refinery's throughput dropped by as much as 60% in the aftermath. Think about what that means in practical terms. You don't lose 60% of the fuel supply for a city of over 12 million people and expect business as usual. You get exactly what we're now watching unfold: queues, rationing, and a visible public erosion of normalcy in the one city the Kremlin can least afford to let feel the war. But here's where most casual observers stop paying attention, and where I want you to start paying closer attention, because the Kapotnya strike was not an isolated event. It was the closing move in a sequence that had been building for weeks. Before Ukrainian forces ever touched the refinery itself, they had already gone after the upstream side of the supply chain, specifically the pumping stations in the Vladimir region that move crude oil toward the refineries serving the Moscow basin. These facilities don't get the same headlines as a refinery fire because they don't produce the same dramatic footage, but in logistics terms, they are every bit as critical. A refinery with no crude flowing into it is a very expensive, very vulnerable pile of steel that produces nothing. Ukrainian drones struck these pumping stations multiple times across May and June, with confirmed fires reported at more than one site, steadily degrading the volume of crude that could even reach the refineries in the first place. This is the part of the campaign that reveals real operational sophistication, and it's worth pausing on because it tells you something about how Ukraine's targeting cells are thinking. They did not simply pick the biggest refinery on a map and throw drones at it until something caught fire. They sequenced their strikes against both ends of the production chain simultaneously, degrading the pumping infrastructure that feeds crude into the system, while also preparing to strike the refining capacity that converts it into usable product. That is a textbook application of what we'd call a systems-based interdiction approach. You don't just damage a single node, you attack redundant points along the entire chain so that even partial recovery at one stage doesn't restore the whole system. Even if Russian repair crews manage to patch a damaged pumping station, the refinery downstream is still operating at reduced capacity. Even if the refinery's processing unit comes back online, the crude supply feeding it remains constrained. This is precisely the kind of compounding effect that turns a single tactical strike into a strategic problem. And it's why what we're seeing in Moscow right now isn't a one-off disruption. It's the visible symptom of a system under sustained, layered pressure. Now, if this were confined to Moscow, the Kremlin could probably manage the optics, reroute supply, prioritize the capital, absorb some discontent in the provinces, and project an image of control to the population that matters most politically. But that is not what's happening. The disruption has spread to at least 15 regions across Russia and Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory, and that geographic spread tells you the system doesn't have the slack to compensate by simply shifting product around internally. St. Petersburg, Russia's second city and one with real symbolic weight, has introduced its own purchase limits, ranging from 50 to 95 litres per customer depending on the supplier. Tatarstan, Belgorod, Kursk, Rostov, Voronezh, Ryazan, Krasnodar, these are not minor administrative backwaters. Several of them sit along critical logistics corridors supporting Russian operations in Ukraine. When fuel rationing starts showing up in regions that border the conflict zone itself, you are no longer looking at a consumer inconvenience story. You are looking at a logistics problem with direct implications for how Russia sustains military operations. And this is where I think most coverage of this story is missing the larger strategic picture. So stay with me, because the next layer of this is what actually matters for how this war develops from here. Moscow's response to the shortfall has been to lean hard on Belarus, dramatically increasing imports. Reporting points to roughly 49,000 metric tons of gasoline and 33,000 metric tons of diesel pulled in to help cover the gap. On paper, that sounds like a meaningful cushion. In practice, against the daily consumption requirements of a country the size of Russia, running both a civilian economy and a wartime military logistics network, it is nowhere near sufficient to close the gap created by 60% capacity loss at a single major refinery, let alone the cumulative effect of strikes against refining and pumping infrastructure across multiple regions. Belarus simply does not have the refining capacity to backstop Russia at the scale this crisis demands, and Moscow's planners know it. The Belarus import surge isn't a solution. It's a stopgap, and a fairly thin one, that buys time rather than restoring capacity. What makes this campaign particularly difficult for Russian planners to counter is its breadth. We're not just talking about Kapotnia and the Vladimir region pumping stations. Ukrainian strikes have also reached the Krasnodar pipeline infrastructure and pumping facilities in the Volgograd region, hitting the arteries that move crude through the southern part of the country. They've struck the Afipsky and Ilsky refineries in Krasnodar Krai, the Taneko refinery in Tatarstan, the Kuybyshev refinery in Samara region, the Yaroslavl refinery north of Moscow, and the Saratov refinery, a list that spans the country from the Volga basin to the southern approaches near the Black Sea. And critically, they have not stopped at production facilities, fuel depots and storage sites near Moscow, Taganrog, Ust-Labinsk, Novorossiysk, Perm, Krasnodar, and Bashkortostan have also come under attack. That last point deserves real emphasis because it's the piece that separates a serious campaign from a scattered one. Storage depots exist for exactly one reason: to give a logistics network a buffer against disruption. When a refinery goes offline, a well-stocked depot system lets you draw down reserves and keep distribution running while repairs happen. By deliberately targeting those depots alongside the refineries and pumping stations, Ukraine isn't just attacking Russia's current production capacity, it's attacking Russia's ability to absorb future shocks to that capacity. That's the move of a campaign planner who understands resilience theory, not just a list of high-value targets. And it's exactly why what looks on the surface like a fuel shortage story is actually a story about whether Russia's downstream petroleum infrastructure can survive sustained attrition at all three layers simultaneously: extraction, adjacent transport, refining, and reserve buffering. Let's pick up exactly where we left off, because the question I posed at the end of the first half, what this tells us about the actual resilience of Russia's wartime economy, has a more troubling answer than most people want to admit, and it starts with a problem the Kremlin cannot simply will away: repair capacity. A refinery's primary processing unit, the kind of equipment damaged at Kapotnia, is not something you replace with a trip to a domestic supplier. Modern refining infrastructure of this complexity depends heavily on precision components, catalytic systems, and specialized turbines, much of which historically came from Western manufacturers or required Western technical servicing. Years of sanctions have already forced Russian industry into a position where sourcing replacement parts for high-end refining equipment means either reverse engineering components domestically, often at reduced quality and reliability, or routing procurement through intermediaries in third countries at significant cost and significant delay. That means every successful strike against a major refinery doesn't just cost Russia weeks of reduced output. It can cost months, because the repair timeline is no longer governed by Russian industrial capacity alone. It's governed by what Moscow can source, smuggle, or improvise under sanctions pressure. This is the unglamorous reality of economic warfare that doesn't make for dramatic footage, but it's exactly the kind of friction that erodes an adversary's capacity over time, and it's friction Ukraine didn't have to manufacture. The sanctions regime built it for them. All Ukraine had to do was identify the targets and deliver the strikes. Now layer onto that the military dimension, because this is where I think a lot of analysts covering this story as a consumer economy issue are missing the actual center of gravity. Diesel fuel doesn't just move commuters around St. Petersburg, it moves tank columns, supply trucks, and artillery prime movers. Aviation fuel doesn't just keep Moscow's airports running flights for business travelers, it keeps the Russian aerospace forces flying sorties in support of operations in Ukraine. When you degrade refining capacity at the national level, you are not choosing between hurting civilians and hurting the military. You are constraining a single, shared supply of refined product that both depend on And in wartime, military logistics officers will fight civilian distribution networks for every liter because military logistics chains are built with priority allocation in mind. That means what looks like a consumer crisis in Moscow is, almost by necessity, also placing quiet pressure on military fuel allocation somewhere along the front, even if the Kremlin's messaging apparatus works hard to keep those two realities from being connected in the public's mind. Any officer who has had to manage a fuel-constrained logistics train understands this instinctively. When supply tightens, something gets shorted, and the decision about what gets shorted is made under pressure, not according to some clean theoretical priority list. This is also where the geographic spread of the rationing becomes strategically significant rather than just administratively inconvenient. Regions like Rostov, Belgorod, Krasnodar, and Voronezh aren't just population centers. They sit along or near the logistics corridors that have supported Russian operations in Ukraine since 2022. Fuel rationing appearing in exactly these regions simultaneously with rationing in Moscow and St. Petersburg tells you the disruption isn't being managed through internal reallocation. If Moscow could comfortably draw down stockpiles in the regions closest to the front to protect the capital and Russia's second city, you would expect those frontline adjacent regions to feel the pain first and worst, quietly, while the cities that matter most to regime stability stayed insulated. Instead, we're seeing pressure show up everywhere at once. That's a signature of a system that has lost its margin for selective allocation. There simply isn't enough surplus refined product moving through the network to protect the politically sensitive areas while sacrificing the logistically sensitive ones. Both are under strain, and that is a much harder problem for Kremlin planners to manage than a localized shortage would be. So what can Moscow actually do about this? Let's go through the realistic options, because this is the part most coverage skips entirely, and it's the part that actually tells you where this is heading. The first option is accelerated repair and hardening, surging resources into restoring damaged refining capacity and adding physical protection, decoys, and layered air defense around the highest value nodes. This is already happening to some degree, but it runs directly into the sanctions and component sourcing problem I mentioned a moment ago, and it also runs into a basic resource allocation problem. Russia's integrated air defense network is already stretched thin trying to protect frontline forces, population centers, and now increasingly a sprawling list of energy infrastructure sites scattered across an enormous geographic footprint. You cannot harden everything. Every air defense battery moved to protect a refinery in Samara is a battery not available somewhere else, and Ukraine's targeting list, as we've seen, spans the country widely enough that comprehensive point defense simply isn't achievable with the assets Russia currently has fielded. The second option is import substitution, leaning harder on Belarus and potentially on other partners to backfill the shortfall. We've already seen the early version of this with the surge in Belarusian gasoline and diesel imports. But as I noted in the first half of this analysis, the math doesn't work at the scale required. Belarus's refining sector, primarily centered on the Mozyr and Naftan refineries, has finite spare capacity, and ramping output further runs into its own constraints around crude supply, equipment condition, and the simple fact that Belarus has its own domestic consumption requirements it cannot indefinitely subordinate to Moscow's emergency needs. This option provides marginal relief, not structural solution. The third option, and the one I think Kremlin planners are most likely to actually pursue out of necessity, is rationing and reallocation, formalizing what we're already seeing informally, with regional purchase limits, prioritized military and state allocation, and quiet acceptance of consumer-level shortages as a manageable cost of sustaining the war effort. This is the path of least resistance administratively, but it carries real political risk. The Russian state has built much of its wartime social contract on the premise that ordinary citizens, particularly in major cities, would be insulated from the direct costs of the war in Ukraine. Fuel lines in Moscow puncture that premise in a way that's difficult to message around. You can control television coverage. You cannot control what people see when they sit for 40 minutes in a queue at a gas station talking to the person in the next car. And this is exactly the strategic logic Ukraine appears to be exploiting, whether by deliberate design or by the natural convergence of military necessity and political opportunity. A campaign that degrades Russia's military fuel logistics while simultaneously generating visible, undeniable consumer-level disruption in the capital accomplishes two objectives with a single set of targets. It constrains the war machine's sustainment capacity, and it erodes the insulation the Kremlin has tried to maintain between the war and ordinary Russian life. That is a far more efficient use of limited strike capacity than choosing one objective or the other, and it reflects a level of campaign planning that deserves serious study rather than dismissal as a series of opportunistic drone strikes. Here's the broader point I want you to take away from this, because it extends well past this particular fuel crisis. For decades, Western and Russian military planners alike built their assumptions about industrial resilience around Cold War era thinking, the idea that a country the size of Russia, with its depth of territory and dispersed industrial base, was effectively immune to the kind of sustained infrastructure interdiction that smaller, more geographically compact nations might face. What we are watching now is a direct challenge to that assumption. Low-cost, long-range drone systems, produced and employed at a scale that would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago, are demonstrating that geographic depth is no longer the protective factor it once was. Provided the attacking force has the targeting intelligence, the production capacity, and the operational patience to run a sustained, sequenced campaign against the right set of nodes, that has implications that go far beyond this war. Any nation with critical, geographically dispersed energy or industrial infrastructure, and that includes major Western economies, should be looking very closely at how this campaign has been conducted, because the playbook being written here will not stay confined to this conflict. So where does this go from here? I don't think we should expect a quick resolution to Russia's fuel logistics problem. Repair timelines for the kind of equipment damaged in these strikes are measured in months, not weeks, and that's assuming Russia can source the necessary components without major delay, which, given the sanctions environment, is far from guaranteed. I also don't expect Ukraine to ease off this campaign. From a pure cost-benefit standpoint, this is one of the most efficient uses of Ukraine's limited strike inventory available to them. A single successful drone strike against a refinery's processing unit can take out capacity worth far more in economic and military terms than the cost of the munition itself. That asymmetry is exactly what sustained interdiction campaigns are built on. And it's why I expect the target list to keep expanding rather than contracting in the months ahead. What this campaign ultimately demonstrates is a fundamental truth of modern warfare that too many planners have been slow to internalize. In an era of precise, long-range, relatively inexpensive strike systems, the rear is no longer the rear. Logistics infrastructure that used to be considered safely beyond the reach of an adversary without state-level air power is now within reach of a determined force willing to invest in drone production and targeting intelligence. Russia entered this war with the conventional advantages of scale, depth, and industrial mass. What we are watching now is those advantages being steadily offset, not on the battlefield in the traditional sense, but in the refineries, pumping stations, and fuel depots that make the battlefield possible in the first place. That is the real story behind the gas lines in Moscow, and it is a story every serious military planner in every major power should be studying closely, because the next major conflict may not look like tank columns crossing a border. It may look exactly like this, a methodical, patient campaign aimed not at the army in the field, but at the infrastructure that keeps that army and the nation behind it running at all.